Past what? We're right on time.
But Dad, you're doing it wrong.
Why are they all honking?
Because you're doing it wrong.
Tell me I'm doing it wrong. I know how to do this.
Hi, Dad. I'm Annette.
Hi.
You're doing it wrong.
Years ago, I started researching an area of human consciousness as it relates to our modern society. As I got deeper into it, what I found became more and more terrifying. A lot of it was hard to believe and even harder to accept. These days, most people accept that our society needs a lot of work, but they have no clue as to how bad off we truly are. After interviewing experts and conducting years of research, in the end, there was only one conclusion I could come to.
You're doing it wrong.
We're doing it wrong.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
I've often felt like a stranger in a strange land, or an alien from another planet, like that guy in Blade Runner. Or maybe just one of those really jacked up science fiction movies where society's become so sick and twisted and inhospitable that everyone's pretty much lost their soul. If 2020 taught me anything, it's that most people can become a danger to themselves and others very quickly and very easily. We've come far in the last 50, 60 years, and we in the West talk a good game around caring, compassion, equanimity, and so forth. But in practice, it's clearly only talk.
People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Following the atrocities in World War II, the term "never again" became very popular. It was almost as well worn as Black Lives Matter or Me Too. But in recent years, we've seen more examples of humanity's inhumanity to humanity than we ever thought we'd see again. In the last 50 years, captains of industry have become greedier, politicians have become more dishonest, families implode with regularity, relationships have become shallow and predatory, and we're more divided than ever. First, some housekeeping. As the title suggests, we're doing it wrong. Well, what are we doing wrong? Well, other than technological development, pretty much everything. In the West, we've come so far, yet not so far. We're still obsessed with power, possessions, money, control, a lot of fear-based thinking. Now, some smart people have written books about how even though our planet is incredibly overpopulated, there are still ways we could solve a lot of the major problems we have. But it appears that there are just too many agendas and competing belief systems to get the ball rolling. We're advancing technologically in every area, but we're regressing socially. So, years ago, I began studying the phenomenon of unresolved trauma, specifically the childhood trauma of people who've been serially abused, either emotionally, physically, sexually, etc. Now, this is different from the PTSD experienced by combat veterans. But one of the things I learned early on is that the mechanism and the part of the brain involved is the same. So with a combat veteran, the trauma is compressed in a fairly short amount of time. But with one of these people who've been serially traumatized in childhood, it takes place over a much longer period of time. To oversimplify, it's sort of like your fight or flight they told you about in biology class. that gets turned on and it never gets turned off. Think about living with that for decades. Another thing I learned early on, and this chills me to this day, is how very easily a child can be traumatized. There are countless examples of kids being put off of a beloved activity, a hobby, or even an academic subject for a lifetime after just a few cross words from a parent, teacher, or another mentor. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Combine that with 18 years or more of serial abuse, and we begin to see how damaged a person can become in a dysfunctional home. Back in the late 1970s, researchers started studying this phenomenon primarily around children who were raised in homes with an active alcoholic. And that started what is called the adult child movement. You started hearing terms like adult child, inner child, reparenting, becoming common therapeutic terms. Not too long after a lot of these groups became established and psychologists began working with these people, who were now adults of course, we started to see more people coming in and saying, hey, I have all of these symptoms, but I didn't have an alcoholic in the home. My parent was a drug addict or a schizophrenic or bipolar or just a real nasty person. And we started hearing phrases like hurt people. Yeah, you get the idea. All right, now I know a lot of people had the same reaction I did when I first heard this years ago. I thought it was a lot of pop psychology BS. And you know what? That's exactly what the mainstream scientific establishment thought too. Today, they hold it up as mainstream science. Today, I can introduce you to middle-aged, middle-class adults who were rented out for sex at the age of 5 so their parents could get drugs. I can introduce you to middle-aged, middle-class men who were regularly, serially molested by adult women growing up. We have an epidemic of depression and anxiety in the West among adults and children. In fact, there are some cities where they have more depressed, anxious, and suicidal grade schoolers than they know what to do with. Do you know why? I do. I sat across from 3 mental health professionals who said the same thing. I asked them, why do we have an epidemic of depression and anxiety and suicidal tendencies among kids? They said, oh, that's easy. They said because they're being serially traumatized. Everything around them is saying, they're going to school and they're hearing the planet's going to be uninhabitable in 15, 20 years. People are going to hate you because you're different. Stay in school so that you can get a good job, but you're probably not going to be able to get a good job because of this, that, or the other thing. I mean, that would engender anxiety and depression in anyone, wouldn't you think? So has there been a proliferation of trauma and dysfunction in our society in recent years? Of course there has. Denying it is simply a delusion. We'll get into the reasons why in another installment, but until then, I'd ask you to consider why we might have seen this proliferation of trauma and dysfunction in our society. Physicists have proven scientifically that the thoughts of human beings can influence the physical world. Can you believe that? Proven scientifically. They've proven that an individual's mindset influences their life outcomes. They've also scientifically proven what mystics have been saying for millennia, that we are energetic as well as physical beings, and that the quality of the energy we cultivate and maintain impacts the quality of our lives and the lives of others. Now, you'd think that this would be the #1 most active area of scientific research going, right? Holy cow! We can influence the outside world with our minds and improve our lives? We need to study this. But it's not the #1 most active area of research. And in a way, that sort of mirrors how people don't use this knowledge to their advantage as individuals. For example, we've known for years that mental stress can destroy your health, but most people don't do anything about it. They stay stressed out and wait until they wind up in the cardiac care ward. In Japan, they even have a word for it: karoshi. So you take one of these serially traumatized people. Just how empowering do you think the thoughts that predominate their thinking will be, and how will those thoughts impact their lives? Here's something else to think about. As I was conducting this research, one mental health professional told me the following: if people really understood unresolved trauma, it would be our #1 public health concern. One of the most famous examples of unresolved trauma ending in tragedy was Michael Jackson, beloved of millions, one of the first Black Americans to realize that kind of success. Yet, he was destroyed by trauma, unresolved childhood trauma. How do we know that? He told us. Michael Jackson was very open about how, when he was a child, his money-grubbing dad, who saw his boys as his meal ticket, really drove them, and Michael in particular, beating him. Michael was very open about that in interviews. He would become physically ill when he was a young man and a teenager when his father showed up. Now, we remember the celebrities who succumb to trauma, but there are everyday people who lose the battle with unresolved trauma every day, many never knowing what they were fighting. Many of them choose suicide. What's worse is that the scientific community is still very much in its infancy in understanding trauma. If you go to a psychiatrist or therapist complaining of anxiety or depression, they'll probably put you on medication, because that's what they're trained to do. Most psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists don't have the skills to even diagnose trauma, let alone treat it. Most people suffering from unresolved trauma spend years miserable, decades even, thinking they're crazy, throwing money at therapists, and taking medications that are no more than a band-aid. We'll be getting into the failures of the medical and scientific communities in another installment, just in case you're wondering. Here's the truly scary part. The more I looked at the phenomenon of unresolved trauma in the context of our society at large, I began to see more and more trauma-inducing situations, behaviors, and modalities everywhere. For example, how many quote-unquote normal families have you seen where shaming, body shaming, envy, jealousy, sabotage, ridicule, and other disempowering behaviors are common? How many quote-unquote normal families have you seen that are dumpster fires of drama and dysfunction with no substance abuse or mental illness in the home? How many teachers or ministers or priests or coaches do you know or have you seen who probably should never have been let near kids, let alone put in a position of trust? I thought so. So what's wrong with us? What are we doing wrong? Well, there are a lot of facets to consider, but there's one fundamental truth at their core, and it's that we are spiritual primitives. And what I mean by that is that we don't understand what we are on an energetic level. Our understanding of our nature and the universe is really only a click above tribes that worship bundles of sticks and mud when you get down to it. And until we come to that understanding, we're going to stay stuck. Now, you might say that a certain level of dysfunction in a society is inevitable, and that we're always going to have wounded people as a result. But is that really true? It wasn't that long ago that conventional wisdom held that men were smarter than women, blacks were inferior to whites. You go a little bit farther back and colonialism was cool, slavery was okay. You go back a few thousand years and, cannibalism? I'll roll with that. So it's not like we're incapable of changing our behavior or our beliefs. When we discovered disease organisms, we learned that we had to adopt concepts of hygiene if we wanted to avoid diseases that had plagued us for millennia. So what do we need to do? Well, it's much more complex a proposition than just resigning to treat kids better or changing our behaviors. we're at a significant crossroads, and what we need to change are the fundamental concepts of what we are as human beings. How do we do it? That's going to require a broader understanding of the dynamics of how we think and behave, which is what we'll be covering in our next installment. See you then.